has taken or is considering in each of the relevant policy areas. Inflation is a major concern for all of us, as Russia's war of aggression exacerbated the rise in the price of energy, food and commodities. This has a direct impact on our citizens and on our businesses. It has become clearer than ever that the Union's energy security is indispensable for a successful, sustainable and inclusive recovery from the crisis. It is a fact that high energy prices weigh particularly heavily on the most vulnerable parts of our populations. Therefore, alleviating energy poverty and addressing the social consequences of the rise in energy prices is one of the main priorities of the Presidency. Last month, the Council agreed its negotiating position on the revision of the Energy Efficiency Directive, which would oblige Member States to take measures to implement energy efficiency improvements for people affected by or in risk of energy poverty. In addition, the ongoing revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive will facilitate more targeted financing to investments in the building sector, thus supporting vulnerable consumers and fighting energy poverty. Let me recall, on 29th of June, the Council also agreed its negotiating position on the Social Climate Fund regulation under the Fit for 55 package. The new fund should help tackle energy poverty by supporting vulnerable households, micro-enterprises and transport users particularly affected by the impact of the new emissions trading system for buildings and road transport. The Council remains ready to engage in negotiations with the European Parliament for a fast adoption of this important file, so the support can reach the most vulnerable as soon as possible. What is more, the Council recently also adopted a recommendation on a fair transition to climate neutrality. This recommendation encourages Member States to put in place measures to support those most affected by the green transition, in particular those in vulnerable situations, and to accompany them towards economic activities that contribute to climate and environmental objectives. In October, we will hold a conference on tackling energy poverty, focusing on the EU approach and sharing the best practices. In the framework of the European semester, the Council will adopt on 12th of July country-specific recommendations for all the Member States. The recommendations from the Commission for 2023 take into account the worsened economic outlook and the higher inflation compared to the Commission's 2022 winter forecast. As a result, for 22 and 23rd, it is recommended that national fiscal and social policies take into account continued temporary and targeted support to households and firms most vulnerable to energy price hikes. The National Recovery and Resilience Plans cover a broad range of reforms and investments that strengthen Member States' social protection systems. These measures focus on the effectiveness, quality and resilience of social protection systems and include also specific measures addressing, for instance, the inclusion of people with disabilities, increasing the adequacy and sustainability of social benefits, and improving the living conditions of elderly people in need of care. The European Pillar of Social Rights supports and guides our work in the social policy areas. The commitment of the Council and its Member States to the Porto Declaration and to achieving the headline targets by 2030 was reinforced by setting national targets on employment, skills and fight against poverty. Beyond setting national targets, let me stress that important concrete achievements have been made since the Porto Summit. Last month, the co-legislators reached an historic agreement on the Directive on Adequate Minimum Wages in the EU. This should significantly contribute to reducing in-work poverty and to improving upward social convergence. The Council has also approved in June 2021 the European Child Guarantee to address the problem of children at the risk of poverty. The implementation of this recommendation is one of our priority areas. We believe that strong political commitment, ambitious national action plans and strong governance at national level is crucial to ensure an efficient implementation. In line with this commitment, we will organise a high-level presidency conference entitled Child Support in the context of the Child Guarantee later this week on the 7th and 8th of July. Rising inflation and the impact of the war waged by Russia in Ukraine create real risks also for youth employment. In the framework of the implementation of the reinforced youth guarantee, the Member States can better design and put in place policies for youth. Let me recall that Council recommendation on the reinforced youth guarantee recognises the partnerships between youth guarantee providers and other social services, including social housing and accessibility services as cross-cutting enablers for its implementation. President, honourable members, I thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much. Now it's my pleasure also to welcome Commissioner Nicholas Schmit. You've got the floor.
Dear President, honourable members, I also want to thank the European Parliament for organising this very important debate on a topic that preoccupies European citizens all over Europe. Indeed, Europe is at a key social, economic and political juncture. We were on a recovery path, but are now facing an unprecedented situation, largely due to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. This war has not only caused destruction and a humanitarian crisis, but it is also an attack on our societies and values in Europe. This has also generated unprecedented challenges in terms of rising costs of living for households in Europe, mainly due to spiraling energy and food prices. The consequences of the current crisis have an impact on supply chains, commodity and energy prices in the EU, affecting many sectors of our economy, and especially SMEs, and so affecting the overall economic activity, as well as the revenues and purchasing power of households. The European Parliament, in its recent resolution of May 19 on the social and economic consequences for the EU of the Russian war in Ukraine, called for action to address the economic and social crisis in a coordinated manner, mitigating the impact of energy prices on vulnerable households and supporting them to ensure a fair green transition with a view to containing poverty while the EU frees itself of dependence on Russian energy imports and on fossil fuels. Parliament also stressed the importance of preserving social resilience against the background of a possible deterioration of the economic and social situation engendered by a protracted war in Ukraine, spiraling prices and high inflation. We fully share your concern and we carefully listen to your calls, which are in line also with the social pillar and its action plan. In times of crisis, we must increase our efforts towards the implementation of the pillar on key issues such as the fight against poverty and inequalities, decent living and working conditions, labour market integration of vulnerable groups, investment in skills and effective social protection. What is at stake now is the social cohesion, which obviously has a wide political dimension. We are already experiencing a significant rise in inflation in the EU, above 8% in June 22, up from around 2% last year. This is holding back the recovery. In the latest EU economic forecast, EU GDP growth for 22 has been revised downward from 4% to 2.7. The combination of high inflation and muted wage growth is significantly eroding the purchasing power of households and increasing the real cost of living, in particular for low-income households. It is of utmost importance to respect now social partners' autonomy. And I want also to underline the importance of social dialogue at all levels to cope with these important economic and social challenges. Vulnerable groups of citizens and workers have been particularly hit by the COVID crisis, as well as the previous financial crisis. The most vulnerable in our society bear the brunt of the consequences of the current geopolitical crisis and the war in Ukraine. It is up to us as policymakers to act and be the Europe that protects. Assessing the distributional impact of inflation and rising living costs and mitigating the adverse effects of these developments on the social situation is of the utmost importance for the Commission. In this regard, I am confident that different initiatives that we have been working on will be key in the coming months and years. Let me mention a few examples. The directive on adequate minimum wages is expected to create a positive momentum for measures enhancing their adequacy. The European Child Guarantee will support children in need by breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty and inequality, and we just heard that the Czech presidency invests a lot in developing this and strengthening the implementation of this child guarantee. The forthcoming recommendation on adequate minimum income will support those who find themselves without any means to find their way back to society and especially the labour market. The communication of October 21 on tackling rising energy prices provides policy guidance to member states on how to support households. Between October 21 and mid-February 22 alone, member states adopted measures in line with the toolbox which eased energy bills for around 71 million households, customers, and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We recently established the Energy Poverty and Vulnerable Consumers Coordination Group with member states. They will discuss the implementation of emergency measures and examine their evolution. In its communication of March 8, 2022, Repower EU joined the European Action for More Affordable, Secure and Sustainable Energy. The Commission provided guidance on the application of fiscal measures on windfall profits with a view to redistributing revenues to final consumers. These measures can play a key role in mitigating the social and economic impact of high energy prices on vulnerable households, as well as on companies and especially SMEs. Tomorrow's plenary debate on taxing windfall profits of energy companies will provide an important contribution in this context. On May 18, in response to the consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Commission put forward the Repower EU plan. The plan aims to achieve energy savings, diversify and secure energy supply, and accelerate the green transition by the rollout of renewables, while stressing that our joint action to accelerate the clean energy transition reinforces the need for effective employment, skills and social policies in line with the European Pillar of Social Rights. We call on co-legislators to adopt it swiftly. Member States can rely on financial support at the EU level, and the European Parliament also rightly called for the continuation of financing support for as long as needed. In particular, the European Social Fund Plus provides funding for supporting children and young people and promoting social inclusion and tackling material deprivation. The funds under the Recovery and Resilience Facility are being used by member states to enhance social resilience and social cohesion, which accounts for around 1/3 of national plans, as well as to address the structural causes of energy poverty. To support Repower EU, €225 billion is already available in loans under the ERF. Now it is up to member states to update their recovery and resilience plans. As highlighted by President von der Leyen, this transition will either be working for all and be just, or it will not work at all. And the newly proposed social climate funds aim to address the regional and social impact of the green transition, including energy, in line with the fair transition principles of the Fit for 55 package. In this regard, proposed limitations by co-legislators on fairness-focused investments should not lead to insufficient capacity to address negative distributional impacts. During the pandemic, we successfully mitigated the risks on employment thanks to the SURE instrument. Clearly, it is an EU success story. In 2020, it supported approximately 31 million people, almost 1/3 of total employment in 19 beneficiary states. In the new future, we have to collectively reflect on new innovative instruments modeled on previous instruments to protect the citizens, especially the most vulnerable, and to tackle challenges related to the reduction of purchasing power and rising energy prices. The current social and economic outlook requires further coordinated efforts between the EU, member states, and social partners to tackle the emerging challenges related to the reduction of purchasing power. To respond to the evolving crisis and the deteriorating situation, our economic and social governance mechanisms under the European semester are an invaluable asset, namely, and the revised social scoreboard, which monitors member states' progress towards better skills and social fairness. We will follow up on the debate on the review of the EU economic governance framework, as well as on the reform of the EU own resources, including the introduction of new own resources. We need to build on the experience of the past 2 years, where we have collectively been able to put the European pillar of social rights at the heart of the EU's recovery, one that is sustainable, inclusive, and fair. The challenge now is to keep the recovery on track to address the rising cost of living in the current crisis. That is also the message and spirit of Porto, the pillar, its action plan, and the 3 ambitious social headline targets for 2030 must drive our joint efforts for a fair, green and digital transition. Since the Porto Social Summit, the EU has continued working towards more social and economic fairness and resilience, and we are ready to pursue actively these key objectives. We heard Parliament's call to organize a follow-up to the Porto Social Summit to discuss the challenges of the extraordinary situation we are facing with increasing inflation and its social consequences. I share the view that we have to address these pressing issues of rising cost of living in the EU in a coordinated manner and at the highest level. And the Commission will obviously play fully its role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your very important and comprehensive intervention in our debate. Now we will continue. E vamos passar às intervenções.
Now we move on to political group spokesmen. And the first one is on behalf of the European People's Party, and it's from Isabel Benjumea. 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you. We see growing inflation. It's rocketing in Europe. This is mostly punishing families, independent workers, SMEs. It hurts anyone who's involved in economic activity, but anyone who's trying to make ends meet. And things have got more expensive. So Europe has put forward a stimulus plan. Due to COVID, this will inject European funds, unprecedented funds. We're talking about the next-gen funds. As we've just heard from the Commissioner, we also now have the Repower EU plan on the table. Europe has shown solidarity. Now we have to make the most of these funds so that they actually help to address this challenge. We need to reduce inflation, and we need this money to reach companies and SMEs and families so that they can move forward. When the member states change their national plans, they must include lower taxes, tax cuts, which will cushion the blow of price rises and of inflation, reducing taxes so that energy and electricity costs are lower. There also need to be tax breaks which will foster innovation and growth. The Commission should encourage the Member States to make the most of what already exists, the next-gen funds, and the Member States should be encouraged to take the necessary reforms and adequate investments so that we can deal with the problem of inflation today.
Muito obrigado. Próximo.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is from the S&D Group. Agnes Jongerius, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, Commissioner. I think we should say that since the war in the Ukraine, energy prices and food prices are going through the roof, and people struggle to make ends meet, while Putin is cutting off gas supply to entire countries. Capitalists make profits by speculating on markets and thereby hurting millions of households. And like I said, people making ends meet are in trouble to make ends meet while companies benefit with huge profits. So we need to have a profit windfall tax and use the profits from this tax to mitigate social consequences of rising energy prices and inflation. We need to coordinate European action now to avoid a crisis in this winter, and I think we cannot wait until the Social Climate Fund is in full action. We need action now. We have a European solution in the SURE instruments, and we need to extend this program to help households and companies to survive the winter. I'm urging the Commission, Council, together with social partners, to take the lead. Please present a minimum income schemes directive as soon as possible and explore the possibilities of energy price caps for basic consumptions for households, so no one is left behind. We need to be bold and we need to tackle the crisis now, heads on. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is from the Renew Group, Luis Garicano. 1 minute, please.
Minister, history teaches us that when inflation reaches these high levels, it takes discipline and patience to bring it under control. But the ECB is entering this battle against inflation with one hand tied behind its back. A decade after the euro crisis, our economic and monetary union is still deeply incomplete. First, we have not created a safe asset for the euro area, and as a result, money flees to safety from the south to the north, placing highly indebted states under more stress. Second, we still don't have a single deposit insurance. The ministers a couple of weeks ago abandoned the roadmap to build one. Third, we still don't have an instrument for common borrowing. This places the ECB in the situation of having to support highly indebted member states, which is not its job. Fourth, we lack an enforceable set of fiscal rules. Now the ECB announces an anti-fragmentation tool in order to be able to raise rates, and, well, they have to know, they shouldn't be naive, they will be tested. And the truth of the matter is that they do not have any long-term solution. This is a non-strategy of temporary fixes, which is going to run out of road very soon. Out of control inflation is always a very hard problem to solve. By continuing to neglect these structural problems, there is a risk that European leaders make this crisis fatal for the euro. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Next speaker on behalf of the Green Group is Ernest Urtasun. 1.5 minutes, please.
Gracias, presidente. La inflación es...
Thank you very much. Inflation is really hurting families. At the moment, Staples have gone up, energy, food, all of that affects the lowest income families. And the European Central Bank is trying to deal with inflation with an inadequate tool, a blunt tool of raising interest rates. It may worsen things, but not everyone is dealing with the fallout in the same way. We need to look at inflation and how it's distributed, because some companies are making huge profits. They're making big business out of this. We've heard that electricity companies made more than 200 billion euros. The same with the food companies. The agri-industry has passed down costs directly to consumers. We therefore need to act. And we need to work swiftly in various areas. The European Council must tax windfall profits. Then there needs to be a true energy transition. That means changing the electricity market so that we can better include renewables. Then we need to help lowest income households and boost social protection. That means including help to the most vulnerable families, as was done in Spain by the government. We also need to have a basic minimum income in... we basically need a new tax, and we need to look at BIFID, because we can't agree on BIFID in this plenary. These are some of the measures that we need to help the most vulnerable against the impact, the dramatic impact of this crisis. But let's not forget that there are actors on this market who are making huge profits due to this inflation.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Our next speaker on behalf of the ID group is Jack Madison. 1.5 minutes, please.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for Mr. from the Council, Commissioner. As you said, very right way, that it's a very important topic. I think it's the most important topic before the winter. And it's so important that we have, in this plenary, we have almost 20 MEPs listening to this debate. I think we have 10 times more people there on the balcony, our visitors. Anyway, just about inflation, about the economic problems. I would like to just mention two things. First of all, we asked last year from the ECB, from the Central Bank of Europe, how will affect the very tough green policy, Green Deal to the European economy? And they said very clearly, yes, it will affect. It will increase inflation. They didn't say how much, but they said, yes, it will affect. And the same thing is mentioned several times in the speeches and in the public opinions by Mrs. Isabel Schnabel. Isabel Schnabel, who's a German economist, executive member of the board of the ECB, and she says same things. If we are crushing this Green Deal forward, it will affect our economy. That's a pure fact. And if you're looking now on the energy sector, and if we imagine what will happen in a few years, if we are, of course, hating so much all the nuclear power and fossil fuels, and we're just hoping for the wind and sun, and I love also sun and wind. It's amazing things. But unfortunately, it's not enough. It's not enough for our energy sector. It means the price will go even more up. It will much more higher. And that's just an economical fact. So that's why I would like to just hear your opinion in today, when we have war in Ukraine, we have this kind of problems in energy sector, and we see the result of the Green Deal in those first year actually. What is your opinion? What is the position of the Commission? Are we still going forward with, in my opinion, crazy idea, absolutely crazy idea? Or are there any plans that we actually will react to the problems what we have already today? So that's just my only small question, and if you can answer, I would be very grateful. Thanks so much.
Muito obrigado.
Thanks very much. Next speaker is from the ECR group, and it's Johan van Overtveld. 1.5 minutes, please.
Voorzitter, commissaris, collega's.
Commissioner, colleagues, thank you very much. We need to implement policy which will address the problems of energy, the climate and purchasing power, because all of these policy areas are interlinked, and we've got to realise that the measures that we take to tackle climate change have an impact on energy supplies and, in turn, a major impact on purchasing power. We have got to make sure that we protect our energy storage, and we can, of course, have recourse to gas and to coal, but that will have an impact on the climate. The purchasing power debate, of course, ties in very closely with the whole issue of taxonomy. Colleagues, my party colleagues are very much in favour of a sustainable energy transition, but we also feel that competitiveness and prosperity for the citizens is essential. We've got to be well aware of the very difficult political situation in which we operate, but the fallout for individuals is great. The impact on the purses and wallets of the citizens is huge. And if in the long term we want to get control of electricity prices and we want to have stable supply policy in energy and we want to do something about the climate problem, we are really going to have recourse to nuclear energy. We're going to be talking about taxonomy. The Parliament is about to recognise that it should be deemed to be a green transition fuel. I think we've got to recognise the consumer purchasing power mustn't be any further undermined. Industry needs competitiveness and we need to have the appropriate fiscal instruments to deliver on this. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Özlem Demirel from the left. 1 minute, please.
Thank you. When I was a young student, a professor said to me, capitalism is the end of history. We see that the time of crises and wars is over. But since then, there have been countless wars and crises. And what I know is that after every crisis, the gulf between the rich and the poor grows wider. Euro crisis, Corona crisis, the attack on Ukraine, and the geopolitical sanctions imposed by the EU. All of these are borne by the people, by the workers. Bread, fruit and vegetables, electricity, energy, everything is going up. We save companies, but workers are supposed to forego any wage increases, and at the same time we are paying for armament. The richer become richer, the poorer become poorer. How? We don't need people to forego wage increases. Instead, we need a price break on crude oil. We need to prevent perverse wealth. And I think that we're going to have a hot autumn of social protests. And people will be saying, we're not going to pay for your crisis or for your wars anymore. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Next speaker is one of the non-attached members, Laura Ferrara, who has 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. President. The increasing the cost of living is having an impact which needs to be urgently addressed by European governments, not just in Italy, but domestic expenditure and rents, fuel, water, energy prices and raw materials. This is always, of course, feeding into inflation as well. The ongoing war gives rise to various questions on our energy dependence and speculations in the market, and one solution would be ceilings for gas and petrol prices. It's also important that we use European funds correctly here, including Next Generation EU and the ESF+. Support for the recovery and helping SMEs, economic and territorial cohesions, need to be accompanied with particular attention to those most vulnerable parts of our society. Let's have minimum wages to allow workers and their families to live decently. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you, says the President. Now we move on to backbench speakers, and the first one is Dennis Radko, as 1 minute.
President, Herr Kommissar, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Thank you, Minister, Commissioner, colleagues. The current crisis has got to be tackled with new ideas rather than the ECB's tired and tested arguments. We've really got to focus on the essentials and on what we can do in pragmatic terms. The Climate Social Fund, which we have been discussing and indeed adopted recently, shows precisely why we need to take prompt action. the German Chancellor is reluctant to do precisely this, and the package that he's put together really does very little to help pensioners or students. And this Chancellor is in fact simply dithering about the social fund, the climate social fund, and doing his best to make sure that there's the least possible money in it. But we have got to try to make sure that the states have their money from this budget so that we can tackle the escalating food prices, for example, so that we can guarantee jobs and so that we can ensure that industry is shielded from the impact of all the price costs escalation, but also, for example, the chemicals legislation. And we've got to get together with the social partners and ensure that we can come up with effective policy. Thank you.
Thanks
very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Bischoff. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President, Minister, Commissioner. We have the European Pillar of Social Rights, and we came up with that in the aftermath of the financial crisis and the social crisis in many member states. We didn't know that shortly afterwards we would be wrestling with even bigger crises affecting everyone. We saw the pandemic, but we as the EU managed to come up with good instruments. But I'm worried, I fear, that this autumn and winter will be a real test of our solidarity in Europe. There's this question, are we just going to come up with nice speeches, or are we going to do what Mr. Radke said, push this all to the national level? Or are we going to come up with European plans and strategies? It's not just about dealing with energy, poverty and security. It's about people who are afraid who are afraid they can't pay for heating, people who are afraid that the money in their pockets will be worth less and less due to rampant inflation. I therefore think it's a good thing that the Commission is going to do everything in its power for a social summit. I want to turn to the Council, excuse me. Do you understand? If we don't get a hold on this, if we don't get a grip on this, then Europe and the world will change. We therefore really need measures. It's already been said, we should cap energy prices. We should tax windfall profits. Those with low and medium incomes should have their burden removed from their shoulders. But we have a real different set of situations, one from one member state to the next, some capping, some not. But when I look at this room, I get the impression that we haven't yet got our head round the severity of this situation. So what is the answer from the Commission? What is the answer from both Council and Commission that's different from business as usual?
Muito obrigado. Próxima intervenção.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Dragoș Pislaru. 1 minute, please.
Very much, Chair. I will talk in Romanian.
Commissioner, dear colleagues, we've been talking of late about the lockdown generation. Now we should admit that the pandemic and the Russian aggression in Ukraine have brought to the surface socioeconomic vulnerabilities. The member states are more and more indebted, deficits are growing, and income of the citizens are wasting and melting away from a month to another. It is no solution to throw money at them from helicopter. Improving the daily life comes from reform, investments, and building strong social resilience, also with the support of National Recovery and Resilience Plan. Improving the daily life will come from the strength we give to the young people, now and not later on. We should invest in the younger generations. Now and not later, we should invest in their education. Now and not later, we should create opportunities for entrepreneurial spirit. The young people should believe that they can renew Europe. We are in charge to open their door to Europe. We need brave measures, fast, unprecedented measures to avoid a generation that would go back to a living standard much worse than their parents or their grandparents. That is why the social pillar of rights in Europe can lead us to a better life for all citizens. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Lagan-Siepen. 1 minute, please.
Soziale Gerechtigkeit ist der Kitt, der die EU, unser Europa.
Thank you. Social justice is the glue which binds our society together. And when we no longer have this in the European Union, we have a democratic deficit, a serious problem with democracy. Social justice is a weighty term. The Minister has referred to this and indeed has said that it is an important concept, and it means that we've got to prevent people falling into poverty. But the reality is that for all the action programme for the social pillar and all the policy proposals that there have been over the years, too many people are suffering from social exclusion and poverty. 15 million people more in recent years. So the member states have got to have a reality check here, because it's all very well to talk about objectives and talk about the social climate fund and even the minimum wage and attempt to coordinate social security systems, which has never yet seen the light of day. It's all very well to argue endlessly ad nauseum about how you're going to achieve social Europe, but you've got to do something, because the citizens need security. They have no security. We've got to have more than simply a minimum income on which people can't even live, for the future of our children and our grandchildren, for our future and for the future of democracy. We need a better Europe. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mara Bizzotto. 1 minute, please. Thank you, Mr. President. Exploding prices, bills rocketing up, salaries and purchasing power drastically reduced. These are the situations our citizens need to address every day, and we have to sort out as rapidly as possible. We want to stop millions of families in Italy and Europe buffeted by energy social crisis, which is unprecedented. We need rapid, genuine solutions before this degenerates into explosive social conflict. But in this tragic context, what we're seeing is the weedy proposals of the Italian left. In Italy, during this devastating crisis, the left's priority on its political agenda is to liberalise cannabis and give citizenship to immigrants. That's enough of this nonsense. It's enough talk. What we need to do is stop following the left, which is living on a different planet, and look at reality straight in the face. We need to sort out these real problems, and we need to start sorting them out now before it's too late.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Michiel Hoogeveen for 1 minute, please.
Dank u, voorzitter. Voor de mensen thuis wordt het leven...
Thank you. For people at home, life is simply unaffordable. Inflation is through the roof. The electricity bills, fuel for cars, gas bills, food in the supermarket, everything is going through the roof day by day. The causes of these are a lack of energy policy and the fact that we are still holding fast to ridiculous climate ideas and ridiculous sanctions on energy. The second problem is that we don't have a proper finance policy being implemented by the central banks. By buying up debt and by crazy funding policies such as Next Generation EU, we are simply accelerating and exacerbating all the problems which inflation brings in its wake. So what can we do for the people back home? We could be saving the billions on these crazy climate policy initiatives. We could make energy affordable and accessible with all that money. We need to see that it's time for us to implement the reforms that the European Union has been crying out for years. This is what the people want. The people want us to change the EU so that it actually serves their interests and protects them. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Yunus Omarjee for 1 minute.
Monsieur le Président.
President, Commissioner, as we speak, a minority of speculators continue to make profit from this crisis and this war. At the same time, European people are suffering. They are suffering from the spike in prices across the board, across all sectors, particularly foodstuffs and energy. And we have to admit it, after the years of the COVID crisis, the European people are exhausted. Exhausted because their living standards continue to worsen, despite having made so much effort. What they expect from us today are immediate decisions and a capacity in these exceptional times to take exceptional measures, to tax those who are involved in the crisis, so that multinationals don't continue to make these huge profits. We should control energy prices and we should reduce VAT on staples. We should index salaries to inflation and we should increase the European fund for the most vulnerable so that everybody is able to eat a decent meal 3 times per day. President, these are immediate decisions that would actually have an impact. These decisions would help millions of European people to actually survive, to actually live and not just survive, to thrive but not just survive.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Jörg Meuthen for 1 minute.
Herr Präsident, werte Kollegen.
President, colleagues, we're talking here about initiatives that might deal with inflation. Now, we should all be well aware of the fact that the consequences of our failure were entirely predictable. The central bank's policies have failed. They have failed. Their zero rate policy and their huge bond buying program have simply conjured up this inflation spectre predictably out of what seemed like nowhere. We have seen what the inflation rate is in Switzerland. It's some 3%. Whereas here it's already over 8%, and that's on an average. So the ECB President Lagarde and her governing council are guilty. They are the guilty parties because of failing to comply with their mandate of price stability. The impact on this is borne first and foremost by the most vulnerable, the least well off. There are no proper social policy initiatives to mitigate the impact on the poorest. It's all just a bit of tinkering with the symptoms in the belief that this is some kind of panacea, but it's not. The restrictive monetary policy has simply delivered very bitter medicine already, but we've got to realise that more of this is necessary, and with Ms. Lagarde, we're not going to see what we really need to see. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Próxima.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Eva Madel for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the Eurozone and the European Union, we have record inflation. Households have to choose what they can buy and what they can't because they will have almost 10% less. The European Union started as a peace project, and prosperity it has given us is very much what keeps us together today. People like Europe because it gives them a good and secure life.
Unfortunately,
Okay,
I can't speak
so
Portuguese,
can
but
I
I could
kindly ask
give
you
the speech in
to restart your intervention, please?
Ще ви помоля да започнете от начало, защото има проблем с... I'll ask... The inflation in the Eurozone and the European Union has reached record levels. Households have to choose what to buy and what not to buy because they will have 10% less. We must not forget that the EU started as a peace project, but economic prosperity it has given us is very much what keeps it together. People like Europe because here they have a peaceful and secure life. Today, we are taking a very firm and clear position against Russia's aggression. We have voted on sanctions and an embargo, and these were the right steps. But in order for them not to be too heavy for citizens, we need to take specific actions and specific measures that are practical and well-targeted. We need to support vulnerable households, but also business in its growth, because only strong economic growth can compensate for record inflation. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Agora a palavra.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Pedro Marques for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Good afternoon, Council, Commission. I'll speak Portuguese because I want the people back home to hear me. We're faced with an enormous social crisis in Europe. European companies and households are going to require investment so that they can meet their fuel bills. It's time to do something. We're hoping for proposals from Commission over the summer so that we can prepare for the winter in the European Union. Look at Bulgaria. 3-person family spends about 25% of their income on energy. And there's supposed to be a 30% increase in energy prices for the forthcoming winter. Things like rent, fuel, transport, energy, all of these prices are going up. And there's also, of course, the question of gas supplies. So we need a coordinated response from the European institutions. That's why we want a social summit to be held in the next few months. We need to do something about energy prices, because the prices don't reflect normal market conditions and are hurting our economy and our citizens. We need to help those families at risk of poverty because of high energy prices. We need to help the millions of Ukrainian refugees who are in Europe, who are fleeing a war. We need to make sure that the SURE mechanism dealing with temporary or employment is maintained and kept going, and also to finance all of this and work at European level. We need a tax on these ludicrous profits being made by energy companies during this crisis. That could pay for all of these European initiatives. We can't put this off any longer. We need to start making these responses immediately. The crisis is already here, and our citizens want our support before the winter. Thank you, President.
Muito obrigado. Próxima.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Anna Julia Donat for 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, everywhere in Europe, the cost of living is rising in an unprecedented manner. In this situation, it is legitimate for a government to introduce price capping on fuels. In Hungary, it happened during the election campaign, but the elections are now over, and the government would now like to get rid of the capped official prices. But it doesn't dare to do so because it's afraid the Hungarians would be angry with the government. What does a populist, a smart populist, do in a situation like that? They will ban discounted fuel for any foreigners. So only Hungarian citizens will be allowed to buy price-capped fuel. Of course, this is against European rules, but that's the point. The government would like the European Commission to launch a procedure against the government so that it can then blame the European Commission for the price hike. So I'd like to ask the European Commission not to believe in what the Hungarian government is saying and not believe in this setup or trap.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Munir Saturi for 1 minute. President, Commissioner, Europe is the second biggest powerhouse in the world. Despite that, millions of people face poverty and social exclusion. 22% of people can't make ends meet. They don't have a decent life. And we look to autumn, but things are currently acceptable. We need to do away with mere national measures. People don't want charity, they want dignity and their rights to be upheld. The European project must be our social shield. We need to have a minimum income in all member states. That needs to come to light so that everybody can live in a decent way, and they must be above the poverty threshold. We must continue with the environmental transition, make it just, and ensure that it creates decent jobs. But we also need to have an energy policy which will reduce energy costs for households. We need to have a minimum wage, and we need to focus on health and housing and foodstuffs. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Christian Teres for 1 minute.
Mr. Commissioner, dear colleagues, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. We talk now about the increase of cost of living in the European Union, which is just a result of the insane and unsound policies promoted by the European Union since Ursula von der Leyen took office. Ursula's plan to forcibly change the behavior of Europeans through higher prices and higher taxes, as she said, caused an unseen inflation in the EU and more poverty than ever seen before. The solution to make the cost of living in the EU more affordable is to reduce taxes so businesses will have more money to invest and create jobs, as well as people will have more money to spend. Ursula von der Leyen must understand that she cannot tax people out of poverty, as she cannot, in a market where demand for energy is increasing, get cheaper energy by closing down sources of energy. Nevertheless, the European Parliament must stop the insane and support the creation of energy from nuclear and gas that, along with the renewable energy, can provide sustainable and cheaper energy, which will make the cost of living affordable for all Europeans. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Próxima intervenção.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Anniko Gyuri for 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, the inflation that has been caused by the war can only be stopped by peace. So the most important thing is to aim for peace on the continent. We have just recovered from the crisis caused by the COVID pandemic. We have to gain strength by reducing taxes, reducing burdens for citizens and enterprises. Putin's aggression has speeded up the green transition, but we cannot make people pay for this. Otherwise, the EU will get into poverty as a whole. It is important to fix the prices of basic foodstuffs, as Hungary has done. The Commission should recognize that in extraordinary times, you need extraordinary measures. Brussels should help member states to protect families. They should stop hindering member states from helping their own citizens. Otherwise, the European Union is going to become some kind of museum where the Chinese tourists visiting Europe can see how we used to live.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker was supposed to be Mr. Schwab, who is not here, so I give the floor to Mr. Eroglu for 1 minute.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident.
President, Minister, Commissioner Schmidt, we're talking today about inflation throughout the European Union, the currency union, and of course this is in part related to and a consequence of the terrible attack perpetrated by Putin on Ukraine. But we need to look reality in the face, and we need to face the truth. And that is that the ECB has also failed. If inflation's gone from 4 to 8% because of the war, it was still at 4% before the war and would have been without the war. And that's still double inflation, double the figure which the ECB's mandate dictates. And therefore, that is a clear definition of failure. We need to have a system which does not create inflationary spirals, and therefore we need reform in the European Union. Of course, that means we need to discuss many other things, like how to manage the crisis and what our role in shaping policy response should be. But we can't just go from more debt to more greater tax burdens and spend 200 million a year coming to Strasbourg without drawing the consequences. We're throwing money out of the window and taking on unnecessary debt and not even thinking about all the CO2 emissions which we're generating by coming to Strasbourg in the first place. Therefore, we need to think about reform right across the board and in context, not just somewhere in the ether. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much. The next speaker is Vice President Mikhail Simechka for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Mr. Commissioner, dear colleagues. The cost of living crisis is indeed affecting everyone, and especially low-income households, but I would like to focus on one group in particular, and that is young people. Because for too many young people in too many member states, even obtaining their own housing has now become an almost impossible problem, an impossible challenge. In 2020, the share of young people living with their parents was over 67% in the EU. And that was before the war, that was before the pandemic, and before this crisis. As rents and property prices grow, housing as such basically becomes inaccessible to millions of young Europeans, regardless of their social status. And now, of course, we must think about how to tackle inflation and energy prices, but I would really like us to see, and I would really like to see a long-term solution for affordable housing to ensure that nobody is left behind and that young people have the opportunity that older generations, including my generation, have taken for granted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now we move to the Catch the Eye procedure. We have 5 requests, and if you stick to the time, we can give the floor to all 5. Beginning with Miriam Lexman. 1 minute.
Well, thank you very much. The conference on the future of Europe ended 2 months ago, and while in Brussels or Strasbourg, resolutions are being adopted on starting the convention on the revision of the basic treaties of the EU, the citizens are concerned by different things, especially the consequences of the pandemic as well as the war, increasing prices of energy and foodstuffs, and we need to bring quick, speedy resolutions. That's why I stress that the opinions on the future of the EU from the 21 member states were not reflected in the conclusions due to the chaotic organizational issues. Up until now, we have not received official translations into all EU languages, including Slovak. What is the signal we are sending to the citizens in this way? Recently, I had a survey commissioned in Slovakia which clearly says that the citizens want from us reaction to the increasing prices and to lower wages, because 3/4 of the interviewers said that they are not going to be able to cope with the increasing prices. EU, unfortunately, often acts in the areas where it doesn't have the competence, and often where it can bring solutions, it doesn't act. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is João Pimenta Lopes for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The vast majority of the population in Portugal and Europe has had to face enormous price increases. Cost of living is increasing, wages and pensions can't keep pace. Production costs are going up for industry as well. And we have speculation and despicable profiteering from this situation. We're talking about providing more money for militarisation and war, but governments are refusing to invest in public services or help the most vulnerable people in their countries. We need measures which go beyond being palliative. We need to address the question of the cost of living increases and wages, and obviously a national minimum wage. We need to do something about precarious jobs. We need to increase national production, substituting imports, and guaranteeing fair prices, particularly in the agri-food sector. Thank you, President.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Lefteris Nikolai Lanavanos for 1 minute.
Prices like energy, fuel, and food are constantly increasing. This is a consequence of the green taxes and the green switchover. We're going to have a difficult summer and winter as well, and people are suffering from inflation as well as all the other problems I've already mentioned. We see the huge profits being made by the energy companies, and we need to do something to protect them from this worsening crisis. What we need to do is deal with end the imperialist war in the Ukraine, do something about energy and fuel prices, and make certain that all of the domestic forms of energy, including lignite, are actually used and taken advantage of. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Michaela Šojdrová for 1 minute.
Děkuji, vážený pane komisaři, vážený pane vicepremiére. Já se teď budu obracet více na vás. Děkuji vám samozřejmě oběma za zprávu, za přístup komise i přístup Rady k implementaci pilíře sociálních práv, zvláště v této době, kdy čelíme krizím, dopadu pandemie COVID a té nejhorší krizi, která nás mohla potkat, a to jsou
Please, I'm
dopady.
sorry to interrupt, but we have again a problem of translation. Let's see if it can be solved.
Now it's possible or not yet, please?
I'm waiting for information on that.
Or I can speak in English.
From the
But I
interpreters.
prefer in mother tongue. So.
Can I have information from the interpreters? Okay, so
Yes, fine.
So let's try again from the beginning, please, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I will repeat very briefly. Vážený pane komisaři, děkuji za.
Commissioner, let me thank you for the approach you're pursuing. I want to thank the Vice Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, who is heading up the Council presidency. This is going to be a tricky period. The impact being felt on social policy will be dealt with by the member states, but there will also need to be assistance provided by the European Commission. You've spoken about important programs that the member states can use. These have been around for quite some time, such as the European Youth Guarantee. But what the member states should do is use their recovery plans and renovation plans. Member states should do everything in their power to help families and SMEs. I think we need very targeted support, and I would also support what was said by Ms. Lexman. We need to not overlook subsidiarity, because member states can provide solutions to this situation. And then at EU level, we need to deal with what is within the competence, within the remit of the EU. Let me wish all the best for the Vice Prime Minister as he tries to deal with the social fallout that we're currently facing. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. We end that series of speakers, but first of all, we hear from Mick Wallace.
President, the Russian ruble is at a 7-year high. Inflation reached a record high in the Eurozone in June. The people of Europe are struggling to survive due to the crushing cost of living, compounded by sanctions on Russia that are not of any use to the people of Europe. We are letting the warmongers ensure the destruction of Ukraine and the collapse of living standards across Europe and driving millions into poverty in the global south. We're spending billions of euros making sure the war in Ukraine continues. We're spending billions of euros on the militarisation of the EU. Since the invasion, NATO countries have committed billions to military equipment in Ukraine. War is a profitable business. The shares of BAE Systems, the largest weapons manufacturer in Europe, has risen by 32% since the start of the war. The best way to deal with the cost of living crisis is to stop prolonging the war. The people of Europe favour peace, even well above punishing Russia. We can do something positive about bringing an end to the war. To date, the EU has made no serious effort for dialogue and diplomacy. We have prioritised the military dimension from the start.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Now, to close this debate, we hear from the Commission and the Council. First of all, the Commissioner, Nicholas Schmidt.
Mr. President, I first want to thank the honourable members for this enriching debate. I think we are all sharing the fact that especially households, but also companies, SMEs, are suffering from these price increases. And we are all convinced that we have to act boldly to mitigate this situation. When we are talking about the courses, I'm a bit surprised, because first, it seems that we have forgotten that before the war, there was a pandemic. And this pandemic has already pushed prices high, because a lot of value chains have been interrupted. When you talk to some industries, they cannot get the material they need. So there is a price hike which is due to the pandemic. The second one is that we are moving into something which is quite close to a war economy. And we should call it like that the situation is not a normal situation which can be easily resolved. And we know where the responsibility lies. The responsibility first lies there where the war has started, where the decision to aggress an independent country has started and was taken. And I think that we just cannot give in to such an aggression, which would then be an invitation to pursue on this kind of aggressions. Now, we all know that in an exceptional period, markets do not normally function. And we are driven in many areas, not by normally functioning markets, but by incredible speculative movements, which has pushed food and energy up. And when you look at the inflation, it's mainly pushed by the price hikes of energy and food, beside the courses I've mentioned on the value chains. And those who now say that it's because of the Green Deal that we have inflation, they just do not tell the truth, because we have not yet seen, finally, some real impact of the Green Deal. So how we see now that even coal factories are relaunched, so we have not yet seen any real impact on this by the Green Deal. But what we know, by the way, is that due to the war, climate change is continuing. Climate change does not wait. It's just there. And we have seen it now recently again in Italy with this catastrophe. So I think that we have to be now serious on really trying to mitigate the impact of inflation. And therefore, social is so important, because social means that we have to work on the cohesion of our societies, because there is also speculation on dividing our societies even more, on creating new kinds of divisions inside our societies, but also among European countries. And therefore, I think the best way now to deal with this is not each member state individually. Certainly, a lot of measures have to be taken individually by member states. But what is needed now is a good European-wide coordination in order to make sure that we are not at the end dividing Europe in those who are able to help and those who have more difficulties to help. And this is a broad issue. This is the unity of the Union is needed more than ever now. And therefore, unity means working on social Europe, working on the principles of the pillar, but adapting also our policies to the exceptional situation of something which is close to a war economy we are going through. And we have to convey to our citizens the real messages, that we are ready to help, we are ready to support their purchasing power, the way how they have to try to make ends meet, as it has been said by colleagues, but also to help companies who will be affected by the fact that they have energy problems, the prices, but also perhaps the supply of fundamental energy will be blocked by, especially by the Russians. And so it's not the sanctions who have created inflation. It's the war, mainly. It's the fact that markets are overshooting due to speculation. And when the OECD, International Energy Agency, considers that about 200 billion special windfall profits have been produced by the fact that markets are not rationally behaving anymore, and some certainly take their advantage out of this, then I think we have to draw the right consequences from that and not put into question now the Green Deal, which is an issue which we cannot escape from. Thank you.
Thank you again, Commissioner, for your very important intervention in our debate. And now, wishing all the best for the Czech presidency, I give the floor to the Minister, Nicholas Beck. You've got the floor.
Mr. President, honourable members, thank you for this vigorous debate on an urgent topic. We learned many lessons with the last crisis, but perhaps the strongest one is that we have to show our unity and our determination. I remain confident that the targeted measures at national level and the instruments adopted and coordinated at the EU level will prove to be effective in protecting the most vulnerable groups and the people at the risk of poverty. I very much agree with what was said, that we need a European coordinated effort and that member states need to be encouraged on how to best use and implement instruments and policies that are already in place. And yes, as Mr. Radke said, this crisis will be tackled with new, innovative ideas, not with business as usual Here I agree with Mrs. Bischoff. Let's have in mind that this price increase crisis has some of its roots in the energy sector. Energy prices hikes are partially linked to the overall uncertainty on the market, which is constantly nurtured by the Russian war of aggression. Our common goal should be to bring predictability and certainty to our energy providers back. That is why our regulatory framework is developing so fast, and you all mentioned them: REPowerEU plan, Fit for 55 package, and also Taxonomy Climate Delegated Act, which this House is going to vote about tomorrow, are few of the many examples. Mr. President, honourable members, we will continue this discussion also in the context of the debate on taxing of windfall profits of energy companies, which I look forward to. But already now, I would like to reassure you that the Council will do its utmost in line with its competencies to tackle this unprecedented challenge. The debate, along with action, will continue at the European level. We will have a social summit ahead of the October's European Council, which will for sure deal with this issue. I would like to close my brief remarks with thanking you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. With that final comment, this brings us to the end of this debate. We can then immediately press on and move to the next item on our agenda. That is the report by Mr. Cañas. EU Action Plan for the Social Economy. May I remind you of the rules for this debate? They are identical to the rules for previous debates. And I'll start by giving the floor to the rapporteur. Mr. Cañas, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. I'd like to start